You're a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your work isn't finished. You've been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII for a task so bizarre, so unprecedented, that you question your own sanity. The Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands before you with tears in her eyes and a request that chills your blood. Your hands tremble as you approach the bed where Ferdinand's body lies. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. But it's not his face that draws your attention. It's what lies beneath the silk sheets. The thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. The anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries but never dare write in their official accounts. Ferdinand VII's member, his grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment that was simultaneously the source of his deepest shame and his most twisted pride. As you begin the preservation process, your mind wanders to the stories you've heard whispered in the palace corridors. Stories of special cushions, of screaming wives, of desperate attempts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel joke. You realize you're not just preserving flesh and blood, you're preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand that he was born cursed, not by witchcraft or divine wrath, but by the poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, creating a genetic nightmare that manifested in everything from mental instability to physical deformities. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic bloodline like a living embodiment of royal decay. Born at El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future King of Spain. His member began developing in ways that defied medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering about the royal anomaly, a dong so massive and strangely shaped that it seemed almost alien in its proportions. Contemporary medical records, hidden away in Vatican archives for centuries, describe Ferdinand's endowment in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the horror of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was more blunt. "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller was considered more refined, more aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive member marked him as a freak of nature. The very thing that modern men might envy became a source of profound shame for the future King of Spain. Ferdinand's childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction that would have broken a stronger man, and instead forged a tyrant. His father Charles IV was weak-willed and preferred hunting to ruling. His mother Maria Luisa was a woman of voracious appetites who openly flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, Spain's de facto ruler. Young Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation, absorbing lessons about power, betrayal, and the weakness of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly shaped his character. The court buzzed with whispers about the prince's condition. Servants giggled behind their hands, courtiers made subtle jokes, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that he was an object of mockery, that his most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his treatment of Spain itself. Ferdinand began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People really were laughing at him, just not always for the reasons he imagined. The prince's tutors noticed disturbing changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became secretive, vindictive, and cruel to those who served him. Servants who displeased him would find themselves dismissed, or worse. Ferdinand was learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt about his body. One particular incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness growing in Ferdinand's soul. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged and his family exiled from Madrid. The message was clear: no one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became clear to the royal physicians. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality of Ferdinand's condition. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 inches in its natural state and growing considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications for Ferdinand's future as a husband and father were immediately obvious. Normal intimate relations would be impossible without significant medical intervention and specialized equipment. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed cushions and supports that would allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury to his future wives. But the physical challenges were only part of the problem. Ferdinand's condition had psychological ramifications that went far beyond the bedroom. He became obsessed with potions and elixirs that promised to normalize his anatomy or enhance his fertility. Court alchemists and foreign physicians were secretly brought to Madrid, each promising miracle cures that inevitably failed. The prince spent fortunes on these quack remedies. He consumed mixtures of ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and rare herbs that were supposed to regulate his royal essence. Some potions were meant to shrink his member to normal proportions. Others claimed to enhance his virility despite its unusual shape. All of them were useless, but Ferdinand's desperation made him an easy mark for charlatans and con artists. In 1802, Ferdinand married his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match was arranged when both were still teenagers, and Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with romantic notions about her future husband. She had heard he was called the Desired One by some of his supporters, and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, as befitted the union of two royal houses. The cathedral filled with music, the streets of Madrid echoed with celebration, and the young couple looked every inch the perfect royal partnership. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely excited about her new life. Ferdinand, for his part, seemed almost normal in public, charming, attentive, and appropriately romantic. But royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber, equipment that the ladies didn't understand but were assured was customary for royal couples. Custom-made cushions were brought in, along with bottles of oils and salves, and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent as most royal brides of her era, understood none of this. Her education had been strictly religious, focusing on languages, music, and courtly etiquette. The basic facts of married life had been explained to her in the vaguest possible terms by nervous older women who themselves knew little about the specific challenges she was about to face. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, Maria Antonia's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster, monster," until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. Ferdinand's member, described by witnesses as resembling a great club with a thin handle, was unlike anything the sheltered princess had imagined possible. The sheer size of it terrified her, but it was the bizarre shape, the way it curved and twisted, the strange growths along its length, the almost alien appearance of the whole apparatus, that truly broke her composure. What followed was less a romantic wedding night than a medical procedure. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required of her. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to surgery than lovemaking. Contemporary accounts, hidden in private letters between court physicians, describe a scene of almost surreal dysfunction. Ferdinand required the specially designed pillow to support his massive member, preventing it from causing injury to himself during intimate relations. Even with these aids, the process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she required laudanum to endure it. The psychological impact on both partners was devastating. Ferdinand, already paranoid and insecure about his condition, became even more twisted when faced with his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma. She began taking larger and larger doses of laudanum, eventually becoming addicted to the substance as a way to escape the horror of her marital duties. Their attempts to produce an heir became a ritualized nightmare that repeated itself with tragic regularity. Ferdinand would summon his physicians, who would prepare the chamber with its specialized equipment. Maria Antonia would be dosed with enough laudanum to make her compliant but not catatonic. The procedure would be performed with clinical efficiency, after which both parties would retreat to separate wings of the palace to recover from their ordeal. As months turned to years without a successful pregnancy, Ferdinand's desperation reached new heights. He became convinced that his wife's obvious disgust was somehow preventing conception, and he began experimenting with increasingly bizarre methods to overcome what he saw as her feminine weakness. Court records reveal that Ferdinand ordered the creation of special restraints that would hold Maria Antonia in position during their intimate encounters, preventing her from pulling away or expressing her revulsion. These leather and silk contraptions were crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles and hunting equipment, adding a particularly disturbing dimension to the royal workshops. The king also became obsessed with timing their encounters according to astrological charts and lunar cycles. He consulted with astronomers, astrologers, and even practitioners of darker arts, who promised to align the stars in favor of royal conception. The palace became a haven for charlatans selling fertility potions, magical amulets, and ritual ceremonies that promised to overcome the curse of Ferdinand's deformed anatomy. One particularly desperate episode involved Ferdinand's consultation with a wandering mystic, who claimed to be from the Orient. This supposed wise man convinced the king that his member's unusual shape was actually a sign of divine favor, that he was blessed with the dragon's rod and needed only the proper rituals to unlock its fertility potential. For 3 months, Ferdinand subjected himself and his wife to bizarre ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions that were supposedly based on ancient Chinese texts. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court rejoiced, Ferdinand's confidence soared, and Spain held its breath waiting for the birth of an heir to the throne. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left the royal couple more traumatized than ever. The first miscarriage, in 1804, occurred in the 4th month of pregnancy. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. What they meant, but could never say openly, was that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality had made the sexual act so traumatic that Maria Antonia's body couldn't sustain a pregnancy to term. The second miscarriage in 1805 was even more devastating. This time, Maria Antonia carried the child almost to full term before losing it in a labor so difficult and bloody that it nearly killed her. The Queen never fully recovered from this ordeal, and her addiction to laudanum became so severe that she was essentially a walking ghost for the remaining 2 years of her life. Ferdinand's reaction to these losses revealed the true depths of his selfishness and cruelty. Rather than showing compassion for his wife's suffering, he became convinced that she was deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir. He accused her of taking substances to prevent pregnancy, of deliberately moving in ways that would cause miscarriages, and of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide Spain with a proper Catholic heir. These accusations, whispered in the corridors of the palace, destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health. She began to believe that she was indeed cursed, that her body was rejecting Ferdinand's seed because of some hidden sin or divine displeasure. Her last months were spent in almost constant prayer, begging forgiveness for sins she couldn't name and crimes she had never committed. When Maria Antonia died in May 1807, at the age of only 21, the official cause was listed as fever and complications from her delicate constitution. The truth was far darker. She had essentially died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. But even in death, Maria Antonia couldn't escape the twisted world of Ferdinand's paranoia. Rumors immediately began circulating that she had been poisoned, not by political enemies, but by Ferdinand himself, who had grown tired of her failures as a wife and wanted to start fresh with a new bride who might be more successful at producing an heir. These rumors were fueled by the suspicious death of the palace apothecary, who was found dead in his chambers just days after Maria Antonia's passing. He had left behind a cryptic letter that was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and never seen again. Some whispered that the letter contained confessions about poisons administered to the Queen. Others believed it revealed the true nature of Ferdinand's medical condition and the impossible demands placed on his wife. Ferdinand's behavior following Maria Antonia's death was telling. While he made the appropriate public displays of grief, privately he seemed almost relieved. Within weeks he was already making inquiries about potential second wives, focusing particularly on women who had already proven their fertility by bearing children in previous marriages. The king's physicians, meanwhile, were working frantically to develop new treatments for his condition. If Ferdinand was to remarry successfully, they needed to find ways to make intimate relations less traumatic for his future wives. This led to some of the most bizarre medical experiments in royal history, as doctors attempted to create ever more sophisticated marital aids and develop new surgical techniques that might reshape Ferdinand's anatomy. As Ferdinand approached his second marriage, his character was already showing the twisted traits that would later make him one of history's most despised monarchs. The sexual trauma of his first marriage, combined with his deep-seated insecurities about his physical condition, had created a man incapable of genuine human connection or empathy. Ferdinand had learned to see other people not as individuals with their own feelings and needs, but as tools to be used for his pleasure or obstacles to be eliminated. His first wife had been a tool that failed to function properly and had to be discarded. His subjects were tools for maintaining his power and feeding his ego. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle that needed to be destroyed. The prince's interactions with the palace staff revealed his growing sadism. He began testing the limits of his power by issuing increasingly arbitrary and cruel orders. Servants who accidentally glimpsed his naked form were not just dismissed, but often disappeared entirely. Guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy about the royal chambers found themselves assigned to the most dangerous frontier postings in Spain's crumbling empire. Ferdinand also developed an obsession with the idea that people were constantly mocking him behind his back. This wasn't entirely paranoid. People really were talking about his condition, but Ferdinand's response was disproportionate and increasingly violent. He began maintaining lists of suspected mockers and planning elaborate revenge scenarios that he would implement once he had the power to do so. By 1807, Ferdinand had become the center of a complex conspiracy involving some of Spain's most powerful nobles and military officers. These men saw the prince as their vehicle for overthrowing the weak government of Charles IV and his despised minister, Manuel de Godoy. What they didn't understand was that they were allying themselves with a man whose sexual dysfunction had created a personality disorder that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the incompetence they sought to replace. The conspirators called themselves the Fernandinos and worked tirelessly to build Ferdinand's reputation as El Deseado, the desired one. They spread propaganda about his intelligence, his patriotism, and his potential as a reformist king who would restore Spain to its former greatness. What they carefully concealed was their growing awareness of Ferdinand's psychological instability and his increasingly disturbing behavior toward anyone who crossed him. The conspiracy came to a head in October 1807 with the so-called El Escorial conspiracy, in which Ferdinand was caught planning to overthrow his own father with the help of Napoleon Bonaparte. When the plot was discovered, Ferdinand's response revealed both his cowardice and his complete lack of loyalty to anyone, including his co-conspirators. Rather than standing by the men who had risked everything for his cause, Ferdinand immediately threw them all under the metaphorical carriage wheels. He provided detailed confessions about every aspect of the conspiracy, named every participant, and begged his parents for forgiveness while his allies faced imprisonment and exile. This betrayal established a pattern that would define Ferdinand's entire reign. He would use people for his own purposes and then destroy them the moment it became convenient. Even as Ferdinand's political machinations were unfolding, his medical condition continued to worsen. Court physicians noted that his member was continuing to grow and change shape, developing new abnormalities that made intimate relations even more challenging. Some medical historians suggest that Ferdinand may have suffered from a rare condition called megalophallus, a hormonal disorder that causes continued growth of male anatomy throughout adulthood. Whatever the medical explanation, the practical implications were clear. Ferdinand would need increasingly sophisticated aids and increasingly compliant wives if he was ever to produce an heir. This realization led to one of the most disturbing aspects of his later marriages, the deliberate selection of women who could be psychologically manipulated or physically coerced into accepting his demands. The palace craftsmen, meanwhile, had become specialists in creating ever more elaborate marital equipment. Their workshops, hidden away in the depths of the royal residence, resembled a bizarre combination of medical laboratory and torture chamber. They developed adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and various implements designed to make Ferdinand's sexual encounters possible, while minimizing the physical damage to his partners. These craftsmen were sworn to absolute secrecy, and Ferdinand made sure their silence was maintained through a combination of generous payments and terrifying threats. Several artisans who worked on these projects were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, leading to rumors that Ferdinand had them killed to prevent any possibility of their revealing the true nature of their work. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and forced Ferdinand to abdicate, the future king found himself in a uniquely humiliating position. Not only had he lost his throne, but he was now a prisoner whose captor was undoubtedly aware of his shameful medical condition. French intelligence had extensive files on the Spanish royal family, and Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality was certainly among the information they had gathered. Ferdinand's 6 years of captivity at the Château de Valençay were marked by continued medical experimentation, as French physicians studied his condition with scientific curiosity. These doctors, freed from the constraints of royal protocol that had limited their Spanish colleagues, conducted examinations and treatments that bordered on torture in their thoroughness. The French medical reports, discovered in Napoleonic archives centuries later, provide the most detailed clinical description of Ferdinand's condition ever recorded. They describe a sexual organ so large and misshapen that it seemed to belong to a creature from mythology rather than a human king. The French doctors theorized that Ferdinand's condition was the result of multiple genetic disorders combining in a single individual, creating what they called a perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. During his captivity, Ferdinand also received word of various Spanish nobles and military leaders who were fighting for his restoration. The irony was profound. Brave men were dying in muddy trenches and mountain passes to restore a king whose primary concern was finding new ways to manage his sexual dysfunction and produce an heir to continue his cursed bloodline. Ferdinand spent his exile years writing extensive letters to various European royalty, seeking potential brides who might be willing to accept his special circumstances. These letters, written in his own hand, reveal a man completely disconnected from the suffering of his people and obsessed entirely with his own intimate problems. While Spain burned, Ferdinand was planning his next wedding night. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds that greeted him were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. They threw flowers, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed. Children born during the war saw their first glimpse of the king their parents had died to restore. The stones of Madrid themselves seemed to sing with celebration. Ferdinand smiled and waved from his carriage, but his mind was already focused on more intimate concerns. His first priority wasn't governing Spain or rewarding those who had fought for his restoration. It was finding a new wife who could finally give him the heir that had eluded him for so long. The king's return also marked the beginning of what historians call the ominous decade. But the true ominousness lay not just in Ferdinand's political tyranny, but in his increasingly desperate and bizarre attempts to fulfill his royal duty of producing offspring. His sexual dysfunction had become inseparable from his political dysfunction, creating a ruler whose personal inadequacies manifested as national catastrophe. Ferdinand's first act as restored king was to commission an entirely new set of marital aids from the finest craftsmen in Europe. He sent agents to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire, seeking artisans who specialized in creating devices for delicate royal circumstances. The resulting collection, hidden away in secret chambers of the palace, represented the finest achievement of perverted ingenuity that the early 19th century could produce. The second wife Ferdinand chose was Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin in the endless cycle of royal inbreeding that had cursed his bloodline. She was 19 when she arrived at the Spanish court in 1816, full of the naive hope that young princesses carried into these arranged marriages. The court physicians had already briefed her ladies-in-waiting about the special preparations that would be required for the wedding night, but nothing could have prepared Isabel for the reality of what awaited her. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of Baroque excess, designed to mask the growing desperation of a king whose reign was becoming synonymous with failure. Ferdinand stood at the altar in cloth of gold, his face a mask of barely contained anxiety. He had spent the previous week consulting with physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious figure rumored to be an Ottoman specialist in royal difficulties, who had arrived in Madrid under cover of darkness. The wedding night was a disaster that would haunt both participants for the rest of their short lives together. Despite all the preparations, all the devices, all the consultations with experts across Europe, Ferdinand's anatomical monstrosity proved as insurmountable as ever. The screams that echoed through the palace corridors that night were not screams of passion but of genuine terror and pain. Servants found blood-stained sheets and broken furniture, evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torture session more than the romantic union of royalty. Isabel never recovered from that first night. Court observers noted that she developed a pronounced stutter and would flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room. She began experiencing what palace physicians called hysterical episodes, but which modern understanding would recognize as severe trauma responses. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she often woke screaming from nightmares, calling out warnings about the monster that haunted her dreams. Ferdinand, meanwhile, interpreted his wife's terror as a personal insult to his royal dignity. His paranoia, already legendary, reached new heights as he convinced himself that Isabel was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. He began having her correspondence intercepted, her food tasted for poisons, and her chambers searched for evidence of betrayal. The king's sexual dysfunction had metastasized into a political psychosis that infected every aspect of his rule. The pressure to produce an heir became an obsession that consumed both the royal couple and the Spanish court. Ferdinand commissioned a series of increasingly bizarre medical consultations, bringing together physicians, anatomists, and even circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomical challenges. The royal bedchamber became a laboratory of sexual experimentation that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. One particularly disturbing account, found in the private diary of a court physician who served during this period, describes Ferdinand's decision to invite foreign experts to observe his attempts at procreation. The king, desperate for solutions, allowed German anatomists and French physicians to witness his intimate failures, turning his marriage bed into a grotesque medical theatre. These observers took detailed notes and made sketches that were later circulated among European medical schools, making Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction a subject of academic study across the continent. Isabel, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic medical consultation, began showing signs of complete psychological collapse. She stopped eating regularly, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a 1,000-yard stare that servants found more frightening than her earlier outbursts. The young queen had become a living ghost, haunting the halls of a palace that had become her prison. The political consequences of Ferdinand's personal failures were becoming impossible to ignore. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, pointed to their king's inability to produce legitimate heirs as evidence of divine displeasure with Bourbon rule. Revolutionary propaganda depicted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant, whose physical inadequacies mirrored his political incompetence. The king's most intimate shame had become a rallying cry for independence movements from Mexico to Argentina. Ferdinand's response to these challenges was characteristically paranoid and brutal. He launched a new wave of purges, targeting anyone suspected of spreading rumors about his condition or supporting colonial independence. The Inquisition, which he had restored upon his return to power, began investigating cases of sexual slander against the crown, creating a climate of terror where even private conversations between married couples could result in imprisonment or death. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd proportions. He ordered the construction of hidden passages throughout the palace, so that he could move between his chambers and Isabel's without being observed by servants. He had mirrors installed at strategic angles to detect potential eavesdroppers, and employed a network of spies whose sole job was to monitor palace gossip about the royal marriage. Meanwhile, Isabel's health continued to deteriorate under the combined assault of her husband's sexual violence and his psychological terror. Palace physicians noted that she had developed what they called phantom pregnancies, periods where she would exhibit signs of being with child, despite the impossibility of conception. These episodes seemed to provide Ferdinand with brief moments of hope, followed by crushing disappointment when the truth became apparent. The Queen's phantom pregnancies became a source of bitter irony in a court already drowning in dysfunction. Servants would whisper about how the king would pace outside Isabel's chambers during these episodes, alternately praying and cursing, as if divine intervention might somehow overcome the mechanical impossibility of his situation. When each phantom pregnancy inevitably ended, Ferdinand would sink into black depressions that paralyzed the government for weeks at a time. In 1818, after 2 years of this nightmare marriage, Isabel finally escaped through the only means available to royal women of her era, death. She succumbed to what court physicians diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, though private letters from palace staff suggest she may have hastened her own end through subtle forms of self-harm. Her final words, according to her confessor, were a prayer of gratitude for her approaching liberation. Ferdinand's reaction to Isabel's death revealed the full extent of his psychological deterioration. Rather than mourning his wife, he became convinced that she had been murdered by enemies seeking to prevent him from producing an heir. He ordered autopsies performed by multiple physicians, searched for evidence of poison, and had several of Isabel's ladies-in-waiting arrested on suspicion of conspiracy. The king's grief was indistinguishable from his paranoia, creating a feedback loop of rage and suspicion that consumed everyone around him. The funeral of Queen Isabel became a macabre spectacle that horrified even Ferdinand's supporters. The king insisted on viewing the body multiple times during the preparation process, touching the corpse and muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask and had it displayed in his private chambers, where visitors reported seeing him conducting conversations with the lifeless face of his deceased wife. But Ferdinand's quest for an heir could not be delayed by grief or madness. Within months of Isabel's burial, his advisors were already negotiating for a third wife. The challenge now was finding a European princess willing to marry a king whose previous wives had met such grim fates and whose personal peculiarities were becoming legendary across the continent. The negotiations proved more difficult than expected. Several potential brides withdrew their candidacies after private consultations with physicians who had served at the Spanish court. Others demanded unprecedented concessions, including the right to separate chambers and the presence of their own personal guards. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction had become a diplomatic liability that threatened to isolate Spain from potential allies. Eventually, the king's agents found Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a Saxon princess whose family's desperate financial situation made them willing to overlook Ferdinand's notorious reputation. Maria Josepha was 24 when she arrived in Madrid in 1819, older and more worldly than Isabel had been, but she carried the same doomed hope that had characterized her predecessor's arrival. The third wedding was a more subdued affair, reflecting both Ferdinand's advancing age and the court's exhaustion with royal matrimonial disasters. There were fewer foreign dignitaries, less elaborate celebrations, and a palpable sense that everyone was merely going through the motions of a ritual that had already failed twice before. Maria Josepha had been better prepared for her ordeal than Isabel, having received detailed briefings from Saxon physicians who had consulted with their Spanish counterparts. She brought her own collection of medical devices and preparations, along with a personal physician who specialized in difficult marital situations. Her approach to the marriage was more clinical than romantic, treating her royal duties as a medical challenge to be solved through scientific methodology. This practical approach served her better than Isabel's romantic naivety, but it could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand's condition. The third marriage settled into a pattern of scheduled attempts at intimacy, carefully planned and medically supervised encounters that resembled surgical procedures more than expressions of marital affection. Maria Josepha kept detailed records of these sessions, noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist. The Queen's clinical detachment seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than Isabel's terror had. He began to suspect that Maria Josepha viewed him as a medical curiosity rather than a husband, and his paranoia expanded to include fears that she was secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence services. The king's spies reported that the Queen maintained extensive correspondence with Saxon court physicians, sharing what Ferdinand believed were state secrets about his anatomy. Meanwhile, Spain continued its collapse under the weight of Ferdinand's misrule. The American colonies had achieved independence one by one, taking with them the wealth that had sustained the Spanish Empire for 3 centuries. The king's obsession with his sexual dysfunction had left him incapable of addressing the political and economic crises that were tearing his kingdom apart. Cabinet meetings were postponed when Ferdinand was having a difficult period with his wife, and important decisions were delayed for weeks while the king consulted with physicians about new techniques for achieving conception. The Spanish people, initially grateful for Ferdinand's return, had begun to understand the true cost of their restored monarch. Revolution simmered in the cities while bandits controlled the countryside. The king's subjects starved while he spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign medical consultants. Spain had become a European laughingstock, its decline symbolized by a ruler whose most intimate failures had become public knowledge. In 1829, after 10 years of clinical matrimony, Maria Josepha achieved what many had thought impossible. She became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the Spanish court and across Europe. where diplomatic correspondence buzzed with speculation about how Ferdinand had finally overcome his anatomical obstacles. Some suggested divine intervention, others credited advances in medical science, while the most cynical observers whispered about infidelity and illegitimate succession. Ferdinand's reaction to the pregnancy was a mixture of euphoria and terror. He hired additional guards to protect Maria Josepha, brought in the finest physicians from across Europe, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. The king's desperation to protect this miraculous pregnancy bordered on madness, as he convinced himself that enemies would attempt to sabotage his long-awaited heir through supernatural or scientific means. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when Maria Josepha began experiencing complications that palace physicians struggled to understand. Modern medical knowledge suggests she was suffering from placental abruption, a condition that could have been managed with proper care. However, Ferdinand's interference with her medical treatment, his insistence on consulting mystics and alchemists alongside trained physicians, created a chaotic environment that made effective intervention impossible. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The delivery was a horror that traumatized everyone present, as Ferdinand insisted on personally supervising the proceedings, despite having no medical knowledge whatsoever. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of premature birth. Maria Josepha survived the delivery but never recovered her strength, dying 3 weeks later from what physicians termed childbed fever, but which was more likely a combination of infection and despair. Ferdinand's reaction to this double tragedy revealed the complete breakdown of his sanity. He refused to allow either body to be buried, insisting that court physicians continue attempting to revive both mother and child through increasingly bizarre means. For nearly a week, the palace was filled with the stench of decay, as the king denied the reality of his losses and demanded that his medical staff perform impossible resurrections. When Ferdinand finally accepted that his wife and daughter were dead, he fell into a depression so profound that courtiers feared for his life. He stopped eating, refused to see advisors, and spent his days staring at the death masks he had commissioned for all 3 of his wives. The king had become a living ghost, haunting his own palace while Spain crumbled around him. But fate had one final cruel joke to play on Ferdinand VII. In 1829, at the age of 45, the king, who had spent decades unable to produce a living heir, suddenly found himself facing an unexpected 4th marriage. His advisors, desperate to provide stability for a collapsing kingdom, had identified Maria Cristina of Naples as a potential bride. What they didn't tell Ferdinand until after the marriage negotiations were complete was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The 4th wedding, conducted in 1829, was a farcical affair that fooled no one. Maria Cristina was visibly pregnant when she walked down the aisle, carrying a child that could not possibly be Ferdinand's. The king, however, was so desperate for an heir that he willingly accepted this obvious deception, convinced that divine providence had finally answered his prayers through unconventional means. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have marked the culmination of Ferdinand's quest for succession, but instead it became the source of new anxieties. The king knew the child was not biologically his, yet he had to maintain the fiction of legitimacy to preserve his dynasty. His relationship with Maria Cristina was built on mutual deception. She pretended to respect him while he pretended to believe her child was his own. Ferdinand's final years were marked by the same sexual dysfunction that had defined his entire adult life, but now with the added burden of maintaining a fraudulent succession. He continued his desperate attempts at intimacy with Maria Cristina, hoping to produce a child that would actually be his own blood. These efforts, witnessed by the same parade of physicians and specialists who had observed his previous failures, became even more pathetic as his advancing age made success increasingly unlikely. The paranoia that consumed Ferdinand's final years manifested in ways that shocked even the cynical courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal madness. The king began conducting random inspections of his wife's chambers at all hours, bursting through doors with armed guards to catch Maria Cristina in imagined acts of treason. These midnight raids terrified the queen's ladies-in-waiting, who never knew when they might find themselves face-to-face with a wild-eyed monarch wielding accusations of conspiracy. Ferdinand's obsession with surveillance reached grotesque proportions. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between his chambers and Maria Cristina's, spending hours watching her through these crude spy holes like some demented voyeur. Palace servants reported seeing the king's eye pressed against these openings during his wife's most private moments, while she nursed their daughter, while she prayed, while she simply sat in contemplation. The Queen, aware of this constant observation, began to move through her own rooms like a prisoner, carefully controlling every gesture and expression. The food-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion that could delay meals for hours. Ferdinand insisted that not only must every dish be tasted, but that the tasters must wait 30 minutes between sampling and serving to ensure any slow-acting poisons would take effect. The king watched these unfortunate servants with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, searching their faces for any sign of distress that might indicate contamination. Several tasters collapsed from nervous exhaustion under this constant scrutiny, which only reinforced Ferdinand's belief that assassination attempts were imminent. Maria Cristina, trapped in this web of suspicion, began showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that had claimed Ferdinand's previous wives. Her letters to her family in Naples, intercepted and read by the king's spies, revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity. She wrote of feeling constantly watched, of jumping at shadows, of finding herself unable to trust even her own servants. The Queen described her life as existing in a glass cage where every breath is monitored for signs of rebellion. The king's paranoia extended beyond his immediate family to encompass the entire court structure. He began rotating his personal guards daily, convinced that prolonged service would lead to corruption by enemy agents. Cabinet ministers found themselves subjected to loyalty tests that bordered on the absurd. Ferdinand would make contradictory statements in private meetings to see if ministers would correct him, interpreting any contradiction as evidence of treasonous intentions. The Spanish court, once the envy of Europe for its sophisticated etiquette and cultural refinement, devolved into a bizarre theatre of mutual surveillance. Courtiers learned to speak in coded language, to avoid direct eye contact with the king, and to carry themselves with the careful neutrality of diplomats in enemy territory. Conversations were conducted in whispers, relationships were formed and dissolved based on perceived loyalty to competing factions, and everyone understood that a careless word could result in imprisonment or exile. Ferdinand's relationship with his infant daughter Isabella became another source of pathological anxiety. Despite knowing she was not his biological child, he simultaneously loved her as his heir and resented her as evidence of his sexual failure. The king would spend hours staring at the baby, searching her features for signs of resemblance to himself or to possible fathers. He commissioned artists to create detailed portraits of Isabella at various stages of infancy, comparing these images to paintings of himself and Maria Cristina's previous lovers. The question of Isabella's paternity tormented Ferdinand with particular intensity because it represented the ultimate triumph of his sexual dysfunction. Here was a child who would inherit his throne precisely because he had been unable to produce legitimate offspring. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest political success, securing the succession, was simultaneously his most profound personal failure. This contradiction ate at him like acid, poisoning his few moments of happiness with his daughter. Ferdinand began consulting genealogists and physiognomists, hoping to find scientific proof of Isabella's legitimacy that would quiet his doubts. These experts, well aware of the dangerous nature of their task, provided carefully ambiguous opinions that could be interpreted as supporting whatever conclusion the king preferred. Their written reports, preserved in palace archives, reveal the desperate creativity of scholars trying to satisfy an impossible royal demand while preserving their own lives. The king's efforts to control his wife's behavior became increasingly elaborate and invasive. He assigned specific servants to monitor Maria Cristina's correspondence, requiring them to report not only the content of her letters but also her facial expressions while writing them. Ferdinand demanded detailed accounts of the Queen's daily activities, including how long she spent in prayer, what books she read, and which courtiers she spoke with during public appearances. Maria Cristina's attempts to maintain some semblance of normal royal life under this scrutiny required tremendous psychological strength. She learned to compartmentalize her emotions, presenting a serene public face while privately struggling with the constant pressure of observation. Her personal diary, discovered centuries later hidden behind a false wall in her chambers, reveals the toll this surveillance took on her mental health. She wrote of feeling like an actress who must never break character, even in my dreams. The international implications of Ferdinand's paranoia began affecting Spain's diplomatic relationships. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments about the king's erratic behavior and the instability of his court. Marriage negotiations for European alliances stalled as potential partners questioned whether Spain could honor long-term commitments under such unpredictable leadership. Ferdinand's personal dysfunction was becoming a matter of international concern. The king's obsession with discovering assassination plots led him to see conspiracies in the most innocent activities. When Maria Cristina requested permission to redecorate her chambers, Ferdinand interpreted this as an attempt to create hiding places for weapons or poison. When courtiers complimented the Queen's appearance, the king wondered if they were using coded language to communicate treasonous messages. Even religious observances became suspect. Ferdinand questioned whether Maria Cristina's increased devotions were genuine piety or secret communications with foreign Catholic powers. The economic cost of Ferdinand's paranoia was staggering. The crown spent enormous sums on security measures, spy networks and loyalty investigations, while Spain's treasury emptied and its people suffered. The king commissioned the construction of secret passages throughout the palace, installed elaborate alarm systems, and maintained multiple sets of food tasters, guards and servants to ensure no single group could coordinate against him. These expenses drained resources that might have been used to address Spain's mounting financial crisis. Ferdinand's health began deteriorating under the constant stress of maintaining his surveillance state. Palace physicians noted that the king suffered from chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what they termed nervous agitation. His paranoia had created a feedback loop where his fears generated behaviors that justified more fears, trapping him in an ever-escalating cycle of suspicion and anxiety. The king's relationships with his remaining family members became casualties of his deteriorating mental state. He began to suspect even his closest relatives of plotting against him, interpreting normal family interactions as potential threats. Birthday celebrations became tense affairs, where Ferdinand watched for signs of conspiracy in the arrangement of flowers or the selection of gifts. Even his brother Don Carlos, who had supported him through previous crises, found himself subjected to investigation and surveillance. Maria Cristina's efforts to shield their daughter from Ferdinand's paranoia became a source of additional conflict. The king interpreted the Queen's protective instincts as evidence that she was preparing Isabella for rule by foreign powers. When Maria Cristina requested private time with her daughter, Ferdinand wondered what treasonous ideas she might be implanting in the child's mind. The simple act of maternal bonding became another front in the king's imaginary war against conspiracy. The servants who worked most closely with the royal family found themselves in impossible positions. They were expected to provide detailed reports on the Queen's activities while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. Many developed nervous conditions under this pressure, creating a staff turnover rate that further destabilized the court. New servants, unfamiliar with the complex loyalties and expectations of their positions, often inadvertently triggered Ferdinand's suspicions through innocent mistakes. Ferdinand's attempts to discover the true identity of Isabella's father became increasingly desperate and invasive. He had investigators compile detailed dossiers on every man who had interacted with Maria Cristina during her time in Naples, searching for physical characteristics that might match his daughter's features. These investigations extended to examining the medical records of potential fathers, their family histories, and even their personal correspondence from years before Isabella's conception. The king's bedroom became a museum of his sexual failures, filled with portraits of his dead wives, medical devices that had failed to solve his anatomical problems, and religious relics he hoped might provide divine intervention for his dysfunction. Visitors to these private chambers reported an atmosphere of desperate sadness that seemed to cling to the walls like incense. Ferdinand would conduct audiences from this space, surrounded by reminders of his most intimate failures while discussing matters of state. The psychological pressure on Maria Cristina intensified as Ferdinand's behavior became more erratic. The Queen began experiencing physical symptoms of stress, hair loss, weight fluctuation, and tremors that she struggled to hide during public appearances. Her ladies-in-waiting noted that she had developed nervous habits like constantly checking over her shoulder and startling at unexpected sounds. Ferdinand's paranoia reached its bizarre culmination in 1832, when he became convinced that Maria Cristina was attempting to poison him through intimate contact. The king began demanding that his wife submit to medical examinations before any physical interaction, searching for evidence of toxins that might be transmitted through skin contact. These examinations, conducted by court physicians in Ferdinand's presence, represented the final degradation of whatever remained of their marital relationship. The international community watched Spain's descent into madness with a mixture of fascination and horror. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals that European powers were actively planning for the eventual collapse of Ferdinand's government, recognizing that the king's personal dysfunction made stable rule impossible. Some nations began secretly supporting regional independence movements within Spain, calculating that the fragmentation of the Spanish Empire would be preferable to its continued rule by an unstable monarch. As 1833 dawned, Ferdinand's physical health finally began reflecting the psychological damage of his paranoid reign. Court physicians noted that the king had developed a persistent tremor, chronic digestive problems, and what appeared to be early signs of cognitive decline. His speeches became rambling affairs filled with accusations against unnamed enemies and references to conspiracies that existed only in his imagination. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after decades of dramatic dysfunction. Ferdinand simply began fading away, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent battling his own anatomy and psychology. In his final days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes calling out to his dead wives, and sometimes issuing orders for investigations of plots that had never existed. In 1833, Ferdinand VII finally achieved the peace that had eluded him in life, through the simple expedient of death. The official cause was listed as gout, but palace physicians privately acknowledged that the king had essentially died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual exhaustion brought on by decades of sexual frustration and political paranoia. The autopsy of Ferdinand VII, conducted in secret by the same physicians who had spent years trying to solve his anatomical puzzles, revealed the full extent of nature's cruel joke. The king's member, preserved for medical study, measured an astounding 14 inches in length and varied dramatically in girth from base to tip, exactly as contemporary descriptions had suggested. More disturbing was the discovery of internal scarring and deformity that made normal sexual function essentially impossible, explaining decades of failure and frustration. But the autopsy also revealed something else. Evidence of deliberate self-harm dating back to Ferdinand's teenage years. The king had apparently spent decades attempting various forms of self-surgery, trying to modify his anatomy to make normal intimacy possible. These pathetic attempts at self-correction, conducted in secret with whatever tools he could acquire, had only made his condition worse while adding layers of psychological trauma to his physical abnormalities. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical drawings and written observations, was sealed in the Vatican archives where it remains to this day. Church officials deemed the material too disturbing and too politically sensitive for public knowledge, creating one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Scholars who have been granted access to these materials describe them as simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling, a window into the private hell of absolute power corrupted by anatomical fate. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the fractured Spain he left behind. Isabella II, the daughter who may or may not have been his biological child, inherited a kingdom torn apart by civil war, economic collapse, and international humiliation. The Spanish Empire that had once dominated the world was reduced to a minor European power, its decline accelerated by decades of misrule, by a king whose personal obsessions had taken precedence over public duty. The story of Ferdinand VII serves as a reminder that power without wisdom is dangerous, but power combined with personal dysfunction can be catastrophic. His reign demonstrated how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster, and how the most intimate human failures can echo through history with consequences far beyond their original scope. Perhaps most tragically, Ferdinand's story reveals the human cost of absolute monarchy, where the personal problems of one man could determine the fate of millions. His 3 dead wives, his questionable daughter, his terrorized subjects, and his ruined kingdom all paid the price for a genetic lottery that went wrong centuries before any of them were born. Ferdinand was both perpetrator and victim of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of individuals who were fundamentally unprepared to wield it. As that royal physician in 1834 completed his grim task of preserving Ferdinand's anatomical legacy, he must have reflected on the terrible irony of his situation. Here was the physical evidence of a reign that had consumed everything it touched: wives, children, subjects, and ultimately the king himself. The preserved organ was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic waste of human potential. In the end, Ferdinand VII achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind he had sought. His name lived on not as a great king or successful ruler, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal dysfunction to masquerade as political power. His anatomical legacy, hidden away in Vatican vaults, serves as a reminder that some secrets are too disturbing for history to acknowledge, too human for legend to embrace, and too tragic for time to heal. The silk sheets that had once covered his deformed body now covered a kingdom equally damaged, equally unable to function as nature intended. Ferdinand VII had finally found peace, but he had left behind a Spain that would struggle for generations to recover from the intimate disasters of his troubled reign. The most perverted king in history had ended as he had lived as a source of suffering for everyone, unfortunate enough to be touched by his power.